Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here, we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams. The rain had been falling since morning. Not a soft drizzle, but the steady, unrelenting kind that soaks through coats and seeps into bones. It slicked the black top of a small town in upstate New York, turning streets into dark ribbons that reflected every glimmer of light. On most days, Appalachian was the kind of place that barely noticed the weather. Its hills rolled quietly, its houses sat modestly back from the road, and the people lived at a pace that left little room for drama. But on this November afternoon in 1957, the town was about to host an event it would never forget. Somewhere beyond those winding country roads, tucked inside the sprawling home of Joseph Barbera, something unusual was happening. Dozens of expensive cars lined the long driveway, their chrome bumpers glinting under the grey sky. Inside, a gathering was underway, one unlike anything the United States had seen before. The men inside were not politicians, though they wielded more power than most who sat in Congress. They were not celebrities, though their names carried a kind of whispered fame in neighborhoods from Brooklyn to Chicago. They were the heads of the American Mafia, bosses, and trusted lieutenants from across the country. And among them, moving with quiet assurance, was Vito Genovese. The air inside the house was thick with cigar smoke, the smell of roasted meats drifting from the kitchen. Conversations hummed low, their words in English and Italian, their cadence quick, clipped, and private. Genovese, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, was not the loudest voice in the room. He rarely was, but when his gaze fell on someone, they tended to lower theirs. It was in this moment, with the business of the underworld being discussed over coffee and wine, that the world outside began to shift. A knock at the front door, not the polite kind. Sharp, urgent, a nervous host peered out and saw the flashing lights. Dozens of state troopers were advancing up the drive, their shoes crunching over the wet gravel, their coats darkened by the rain. In the distance, more cars arrived, tires hissing against the pavement. What happened next has been told in countless ways, some embellished, others pared down to the bare facts. But the truth is this: chaos erupted. Men bolted for the back doors, their polished shoes slipping in the mud as they scrambled through the woods. Some climbed over fences, others vanished into neighboring fields, their fine coats snagged by bare November branches. A few tried to talk their way past the police, but their tailored suits and nervous eyes betrayed them. In the middle of this scene, Vito Genovese did not run. He did not shout. He did not break stride. Instead, he moved toward the nearest exit with the unhurried calm of a man leaving a dinner party early. His hat was pulled low against the rain, his hands tucked neatly into his coat pockets. To those watching, it was as if he knew that whatever was coming was not the end, merely an inconvenience. The Apple meeting would go down in history as the moment America could no longer deny the existence of a national crime syndicate. Newspapers called it a disaster for organized crime. The FBI called it a breakthrough, but for Genovese it was something else entirely, a test of control, of composure under fire. The scene fades. The camera, if there were one, would pull slowly backward through the rain, through the smoke-filled rooms, through the frantic figures darting into the trees. It would retreat through the years, rewinding time until the noise fades and the streets are quieter. Now we are somewhere else entirely, the city. New York, it is a younger time, before the tailored suits and the headlines. The sidewalks are slick with evening mist, the lamplight spilling in soft golden pools on the pavement. Somewhere, the faint sound of an accordion drifts from an open window. In this setting, the story of Vito Genovese truly begins. Not with romance, not with heroism, but with ambition, sharp, unyielding, and patient. Genovese was not a man who built his life in sudden leaps. He did it in steps, quiet, deliberate, each one calculated. He was shorter than most men, but the set of his shoulders and the weight of his gaze erased the difference. In his world, presence was not measured in inches, even then. Those who knew him spoke of two qualities that seemed to define him: the ability to wait for the right moment, and the certainty that when it arrived, he would act without hesitation. It is tempting to imagine that power in the Mafia came only to those willing to spill blood in the street, to those who shouted the loudest or struck the hardest. But Genovese understood something more refined. That influence could be built in whispers, in rooms where the curtains were drawn, in favors that demanded repayment months or years later. This understanding would shape his path as the years unfolded. New York's underworld began to shift. Prohibition had once made kings of certain men, but the end of it left others scrambling to hold on to what they had built. In these moments of uncertainty, opportunity often appears for those who are watching closely enough. Genovese was watching. The streets of Little Italy were his early classroom. He learned which shopkeepers paid without protest, which politicians might be persuaded to turn their heads, which rivals underestimated him. He learned that loyalty was a currency, but one that could be spent only once. And he learned, above all, that survival depended on being useful to those above you, while never appearing as a threat until it was too late to stop you. Decades later, in that rainy yard in Appalachian, all of these lessons would converge. The police may have thought they had cornered the nation's criminal elite. In truth, they had only scattered the pieces of a game already in motion. For Genovese, the meeting was not the culmination of his career, but a step, one more movement in a life defined by deliberate positioning. As the rain drummed steadily on that November day, the men who fled into the trees would return to cities across America, shaken but not broken. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, Vito Genovese would continue to move unseen, reshaping the very structure of organized crime. When the newspapers called him ruthless, they were not wrong. But ruthlessness alone does not explain how he endured when so many others fell. It was the way he balanced that ruthlessness with patience, the way he could let the storm pass without the need to shout over it. This is where our journey begins, with a man walking calmly through the chaos, his hat pulled low, his mind already 3 moves ahead. The rain would stop, the lights would fade, but the shadow of Vito Genovese was only beginning to grow. The sun in Campania had a particular way of rising, not abruptly, not with fanfare, but like a slow exhale over the hills. In the small village outside Naples where Vito Genovese was born in 1897, the mornings smelled of bread baking in clay ovens and the faint brine of the nearby sea. The streets were narrow ribbons of stone, winding between weathered buildings that seemed older than memory itself. To an outsider, it might have seemed but to those who lived here, beauty was never free from its price. The Camorra's presence was not loud or theatrical. It was in the way certain men walked without fear, the way debts were repaid without question, the way silence was valued more than truth. Vito's father, a laborer, carried himself with the quiet resignation of a man who knew the rules of survival. His hands were hardened from years of work, his eyes dulled by the knowledge that effort alone could not rewrite destiny. Around the dinner table, talk was sparse, and when certain names were mentioned, his father's voice would drop, not out of superstition, but caution. For young Vito, life was a study in observation. He watched the way power moved, not through official titles, but through whispered agreements and subtle nods in shadowed corners. He noticed how respect was not given, but taken, and how those willing to act decisively could bend the world in their favor. By the early 1910s, Italy was stirring restlessly. Poverty deepened, and the distant murmurs of war crept closer. For families like the Genoveses, opportunity seemed less like a promise and more like a door slowly closing. And so, in 1913, Vito's parents made a decision that would alter the trajectory of their lives, and, unknowingly, the history of organized crime in America. The voyage across the Atlantic was not the romantic adventure that hopeful immigrants imagined. The ship was a vast, groaning thing of metal and wood, smelling of rust, salt, and the crowded press of humanity. In steerage, the air was thick, carrying the mingled scents of unwashed clothes, sea brine, and damp bread. The days blurred into one another, grey waves rolling endlessly, the distant cries of gulls disappearing as the ship pushed further into the cold. Open ocean dot for Vito, only 16 years old. The journey was a lesson in endurance. He stood on the deck when he could, the wind cutting sharp against his face, his eyes locked on the horizon as though he could will America into sight. Nights were spent listening to the deep, rhythmic churn of the engines. A reminder that there was no turning back. Asterisk when the Statue of Liberty finally emerged from the mist. It was not the beacon of freedom it would later be romanticized as. For Vito, it was something else entirely, a marker, a signal that he had stepped onto a new playing field, one where the stakes were higher, the rules different, and the possibilities far greater. New York in 1913 was a city in constant motion. The streets of Lower Manhattan's Little Italy were alive with noise, the calls of street vendors, the clatter of carriage wheels, the shouts of children weaving between adults, carrying baskets of bread or fish wrapped in newspaper. Laundry hung in crooked lines between tenement buildings, fluttering like flags of survival. The Genovese family settled into this crowded, churning neighborhood where opportunity and danger often wore the same face. Work for Vito's father was uncertain, and the wages barely covered rent and food. But for Vito, the city was an education, one that taught far more than any school could offer. He learned which streets to walk down and which to avoid after dark. He learned the names of men who were not politicians, but who still seemed to have influence in every corner, shop, and bar. They were part of the local mafia network, a loose but growing organization of men who understood the business of power. At first, his connections were minor, almost incidental, delivering packages, passing along messages, running small errands for men who tipped well if you didn't ask questions. But Vito asked questions, not directly, but with his eyes and his silence. He watched the way money moved, the way debts were enforced, the way loyalty was tested in small, deliberate ways. These were not the brutish thugs of dime novels. They were businessmen of a certain breed, capable of charm, capable of menace, and careful never to confuse the two. In their company, Vito began to understand the subtler aspects of control, patience, timing, and the value of being underestimated by his late teens. Vito was already part of the neighborhood's informal machinery. He was not a boss, not even a significant player, but he carried himself differently from other boys his age. While others wasted afternoons in idle chatter, Vito leaned against a lamppost on Mulberry Street, watching, noticing, learning. He saw how some men thrived while others disappeared, how fortunes rose and fell without warning. He understood, even then, that the difference between a man who survived and a man who ruled came down to foresight, the ability to see not just the moment in front of you, but the one coming 3 steps later. It was here, in the restless streets of New York's immigrant quarter, that the seeds of his ambition took root. They were small, almost invisible, but they were there, growing in the quiet spaces between his words. In the measured way he moved through the world, and though no one could have known it then, those seeds would one day grow into something vast and formidable, something that would change the very balance of power in the American underworld. For now, though, Vito Genovese was just another face in the crowd, a young man standing beneath the dim glow of a street, the noise of the city swirling round him, his gaze steady, his mind already calculating the steps that lay ahead. The 1920s were a decade of contradictions. In the daylight, New York sparkled with the optimism of a city roaring into modernity. The rattle of streetcars, the glint of sunlight on skyscraper steel, the syncopated rhythms of jazz spilling from open windows. But at night, in the alleys and basements, in rooms where the curtains were drawn tight, another city thrived. A city without laws, or rather, with laws of its own. Prohibition had been meant to purify America's morals. Instead, it poured gasoline onto the fire of organized crime. Speakeasies bloomed like nocturnal flowers. Bottles traveled hidden in crates of fruit, under mounds of coal, or in the bellies of trucks driven by men who knew when to smile and when to keep their mouths shut. Fortunes rose and fell not on Wall Street, but in these hidden economies. For Vito Genovese, still a young man but already seasoned by the streets of Little Italy, this was not chaos, it was opportunity. Every shipment of liquor was a rung in a ladder, every handshake a calculated investment. He did not rush, he observed. He knew that in a world where so many clawed desperately for the top, the man who moved slowly, deliberately, was often the one who got there first. It was during this era that Vito forged a bond with Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano was charisma in motion, a man who could make friends of enemies and turn obstacles into stepping stones. Together, they made a study in contrasts. Luciano, the diplomat, Genovese, the tactician, where Luciano's smile disarmed, Genovese's silence unsettled. Yet in that difference lay their strength. Their partnership flourished in the smuggling networks that laced through New York's docks and warehouses. The city's waterfront, with its shifting tides and uncounted crates, became their lifeline. There, Vito learned to read the signs that mattered. A dock worker's sidelong glance, the timing of a night watchman's footsteps, the subtle differences between legitimate cargo and something worth far more competition was fierce. But Vito's way of removing rivals was unlike the crude violence that often made headlines. He preferred subtler methods, an offer that quietly made a man's current position untenable. A rumor placed in the right ear at the right time. Sometimes a disappearance was necessary, but even then it happened away from the noise. No spectacle, no trail, just absence. He was patient in the way a chess player is patient, never making a move without seeing the shape of the endgame, while others boasted of their successes in crowded speakeasies. Vito kept his words measured, his eyes on the bigger board. In 1931, the board itself changed. Giuseppe Joe, the boss Masseria, had long ruled as one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York. His control maintained through brute force and a refusal to adapt to the shifting realities of organized crime. But times were changing. The younger generation, men like Luciano and Genovese, saw a future built not on feuding families but on cooperation, a syndicate that would divide territories and profits with precision rather than bullets. The Castellan war had already thinned the ranks, the streets littered with the invisible debris of betrayal and shifting alliances. Luciano, always the strategist, knew that the war could not end without removing Masseria, and for that he needed someone who could be trusted to help orchestrate what had to be done quietly, efficiently, without a single misstep. Vito was that man. On an April afternoon, Masseria was lured to a Coney Island restaurant for what he thought was a meeting of trust. Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Moments later, gunman entered, and Masseria's reign ended over a half-finished plate of linguine. Vito was not one of the triggermen that day, but his fingerprints were on the plan. Invisible yet undeniable, the power vacuum left in Masseria's absence was quickly filled, with the help of Salvatore Maranzano, who himself would soon be removed when his ambition outpaced his allies. Patience, Luciano and his closest associates reorganized the Mafia into the Commission, a governing body designed to settle disputes and divide territories without the chaos of open war. It was a blueprint that would define organized crime in America for decades. Vito's reward was not in titles, at least not immediately. He understood something most did not, that real power was not always announced. By aligning himself so closely with Luciano, and by playing a quiet yet pivotal role in reshaping the Mafia, he ensured a place at the table where the true decisions were made. And at that table, his voice was low, measured, and always listened to. The Prohibition years drew to a close in 1933, but by then Vito's position was secure. While the country celebrated the return of legal liquor, the underworld adapted. The same networks that had smuggled whiskey could move narcotics, control gambling, manipulate unions. The profits shifted form, but they did not dry up. Vito had climbed the ladder, not through bluster, but through precision. Each step a calculation, each alliance chosen with care. He was not the loudest man in the room, but in a world of dangerous men, he was one of the most dangerous, because he knew that silence, wielded correctly, could be as sharp as any blade. The streets of New York had a long memory, and already they were beginning to remember his name. The year was 1937, and the streets of New York seemed to hum with Vito Genovese's presence, even when he was nowhere in sight. His influence had seeped into the alleys and corner cafes, into the smoke-filled back rooms, where decisions worth millions were made with a quiet nod. He had reached a point where his name was a currency of its own, whispered in reverence, or in fear, depending on who carried it on their tongue. But power, like a tide, is never truly still. It can swell and recede without warning. For Vito, the first sign of the tide turning came not from an enemy within the Mafia, but but from the long arm of the law. A single murder charge, the kind of accusation that could unravel even the strongest empire, rose up from the streets, with witnesses ready to point their fingers in his direction. The case was dangerous not because the evidence was unshakable, but because the climate was right for someone to make an example of him. New York's authorities had been looking for a way to wound the organization, and here, they thought, was their chance. Vito did not wait to see whether the noose would tighten. His exit from America was swift and without ceremony. One moment he was seen in Manhattan, the next he was gone. By the time the city began to digest the news, he was already halfway across the Atlantic, heading toward a land that had shaped his earliest instincts, Italy. Naples in the late 1930s was a city draped in contradictions. Its narrow streets carried the scent of fresh bread and diesel fuel, of sea air and sweat. Laundry flapped from windows like silent flags of survival, even as the fascist regime under Mussolini tightened its grip. To an outsider, the city was alive with color and music. To someone like Vito Genovese, it was a chessboard here. Survival meant more than adapting to the rhythms of daily life. It meant understanding the invisible web that connected the powerful to the desperate, the political to the criminal. The Camorra, Naples' entrenched underworld, was a force both feared and respected, but to Vito, they were also a network waiting to be woven into his own designs. He did not arrive as a refugee from the law, though that was technically what he was. He arrived as an operator, a man who understood the language of power, whether it was spoken in Italian or English, whether it wore a silk tie or a military uniform. Mussolini's Italy was a theater where politics and criminal enterprise often shared the same backstage. The black market thrived under the rationing of goods, and Vito slipped into that economy as though it had been designed for him. Sugar, coffee, textiles, anything rationed, anything scarce, could be found if you knew the right hands to shake, the right pockets to fill. Rumors began to swirl, as they always did around him. Some said he was growing close to officials within the fascist regime, that his influence reached into places where politics blurred into opportunism. Others whispered that he was untouchable because he had something to offer both sides, criminals and politicians alike. Vito himself would never confirm such tales. He had learned long ago that the power of a story often lay in its uncertainty. As Europe edged closer to war, Naples braced itself. The streets grew darker, the voices quieter. Allied bombers would soon make the city a target, but for now, daily life carried on in that peculiar tension that hangs before a storm. For Vito, this was not a time of retreat, but of careful consolidation. He built networks that spanned both continents, money and favors flowing between Naples and New York. An invisible artery that kept him connected to the life he had left behind. The Mafia in America might have been far away, but it was never beyond reach. Then, in 1943, the world shifted again. The Allies landed in Italy. The fascist regime began to crumble, and the streets of Naples filled with both celebration and chaos. When American troops marched into the city in 1944, Vito did not greet them as an enemy. He presented himself as an asset, fluent in English and Italian, familiar with the city's underbelly and its formal officers alike. He was perfectly positioned to be useful. For a time, he even served as an interpreter for the US Army to the soldiers. He was a local who could open doors and smooth conversations. To Vito, it was another act in a long-running play. Every conversation was a potential transaction. Every introduction an investment in future leverage. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. It was in Italy, under the gaze of foreign soldiers, that whispers of his murder charge in America caught up with him. The US military police began to see more than just an interpreter. They began to see a fugitive. The extradition order was signed, and once again, Vito's world shifted. His return to America in 1945 was not the triumphant homecoming of a king, nor was it the disgrace of a prisoner. It was something stranger, the re-emergence of a man who seemed immune to the normal consequences of life. The murder charges that had driven him into exile collapsed like a poorly built stage set. Witnesses faltered. Evidence evaporated. Some said it was intimidation. Others said it was influence. But in the end, it didn't matter. Vito walked free, just as he always seemed to. Back in New York, the city had changed in small, subtle ways. The war had reshaped industries, neighborhoods, even the pace of the streets. But in the dimly lit back rooms, in the shadowed corners of bars and clubs, the rules of power were the same. Vito did not rush to reclaim a spotlight he had never truly sought. Instead, he returned like a tide washing over familiar shores, moving quietly, reclaiming space, not through loud declarations, but through presence. Meetings resumed, deals were struck, and those who had doubted whether exile would weaken him now understood a different truth. Distance had only given him time to think. In the years that followed, the shadow he cast would stretch further still. But the lesson of this chapter, the lesson of his flight, his survival, and his return, was one of inevitability. For Vito Genovese's obstacles were not endings. They were detours. And no matter how far the road twisted, it always seemed to lead him back to power. The mid-1950s were a dangerous time to be at the top of New York's underworld. Not because of a war, but because of something far worse, an invisible one. The Luciano crime family, the largest and most influential in America, was showing cracks. On the surface, Frank Costello sat firmly in the boss's chair. A man of charm and polish, Costello believed in diplomacy. He preferred handshakes over bullets. His kingdom ran on connections, judges, senators, police captains, all men who could be convinced with favors, influence, and the promise of peace. But across the table sat Vito Genovese, quiet, patient, watching, and Vito did not believe in peace. In his eyes, fear was the only true currency. Fear never wavered. Fear never betrayed you. And fear was the foundation on which he intended to rule. For years, Genovese had been studying Costello, noting every weakness, his reliance on political protection, his reluctance to use violence, his habit of trusting too many people. In the world Vito inhabited, these weren't strengths. They were flaws waiting to be exploited. The coup didn't begin with a bullet. It began with whispers. Meetings were held in the quiet corners of restaurants. Drinks were poured. Promises made. One by one, key captains began drifting toward Genovese's orbit. He didn't ask for open rebellion. He simply positioned himself as the future. The man who would restore the family's dominance through strength, not compromise. Every move was deliberate. Every word was calculated when Costello made a decision. Genovese would question it, politely, indirectly, but enough to plant doubt. If a job failed, he would quietly point out that such a thing wouldn't have happened under stronger leadership. It was a chess game, and Genovese was moving his pieces with surgical precision by 1957. The family was split between two worlds, Costello's, built on politics, and Genovese's, built on muscle. The streets could feel the tension, though no one dared speak it aloud. It was like the air before a summer storm, heavy, electric. Inevitable, then came the moment. May 2nd, 1957. Frank Costello left his Manhattan apartment building, unaware that the game was about to end. A man stepped from the shadows, raised a gun, and fired. The bullet grazed Costello's head, just inches from ending his life. Blood ran down his temple, but he survived. The shooter was Vincent, the Chin Gigante, one of Genovese's loyal soldiers. When police arrived, Costello famously told them, "I don't know who shot me, and I wouldn't tell you if I did." But everyone in the underworld knew exactly where the order had come from. Costello could have fought back. He could have gathered his allies, declared war, and forced the streets to choose sides. But the attempt on his life had spoken louder than any negotiation ever could. He was tired, weary of the endless maneuvering. Just days later, without ceremony, Costello stepped down. There was no coronation, no dramatic announcement. Power simply shifted, as if by gravity, into Genovese's hands. And with that, the Luciano family became the Genovese family. Genovese didn't celebrate. That wasn't his way. He began the work of remaking the organization into something sharper, colder, more efficient. Every racket, from construction unions to narcotics to labor racketeering, now flowed through a single, tightly controlled hierarchy. Under Costello, there had been room for negotiation. Under Genovese, there was only obedience. Capos, who once acted with autonomy, now had to seek approval for every major move. Profits were accounted for down to the last dollar. Mistakes were tolerated only once. And betrayal, even suspected, was met with swift, final consequences. The family expanded deeper into construction, embedding itself into major building projects across the city. Concrete, steel, and manpower, all touched by Genovese's reach. If you wanted a skyscraper built in New York, you paid the family. If you wanted a dock cleared, a shipment moved, a strike avoided, you paid the family. At the same time, narcotics moved in from overseas. Heroin and cocaine shipped in hidden compartments, distributed through carefully managed networks. Genovese understood that drugs brought risk, but they also brought enormous profit. And unlike Costello, he was willing to take that risk. Every operation was run like a military campaign. Every man knew his place. Law enforcement began to notice the change. The Genovese family was quieter in public, but far more ruthless in private. Police informants spoke of meetings where Genovese said almost nothing, letting his lieutenants talk, while he simply listened, his eyes sharp, weighing each word. It was unnerving, because in Genovese's world, silence was never empty. It was a warning. By the end of 1957, his control was absolute. Even the Mafia's ruling commission, a council of bosses from New York and beyond, recognized his power. They might not have liked him, but they respected the reach of his empire. Still, Genovese knew that power was never permanent. The same quiet moves he had used to unseat Costello could one day be used against him. And so he doubled down on discipline. He kept his circle tight. He trusted no one fully. He cultivated an image of the untouchable, a man above petty feuds, a leader whose will was law. The chapter closes on a single image, a long table in a dimly lit room. The air is heavy with cigarette smoke. At the far end, Genovese sits, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly on the polished wood dot around him. Capos and lieutenants speak in low tones, reporting on money earned, deals made, problems solved. Genovese listens, eyes moving from face to face. When he does speak, it's only a few words, but those words are enough to send men moving. Orders carried out without question. He doesn't need to raise his voice. Everyone already knows who commands the empire now. The cold hit first. A November wind that cut through coats and gloves, turning breath into pale clouds against the bare trees of upstate New York. The little town of Appalachian wasn't the kind of place you expected to find history. A few streets, a scattering of houses, rolling hills that seemed to hold nothing but silence. But on the morning of November 14th, 1957, that silence was broken by the low purr of expensive engines, Cadillacs, Lincolns, Buicks with polished chrome. One after another, they climbed the narrow road toward the secluded home of Joseph Joe, the barber. Barbara, a man whose real business had nothing to do with haircuts. Inside Barbara's estate, men arrived in tailored suits and heavy overcoats. They shook hands at the door, exchanged quiet greetings, and stepped into a room thick with cigar smoke. They were bosses, from New York, from Chicago, from Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia. The weight of the American underworld gathered in one place, and at the center of it all was Vito Genovese. This was more than a meeting. It was a coronation. Just months earlier, Genovese had pushed Frank Costello from power without firing another shot. Now, this gathering would formalize what everyone already knew, that Genovese wasn't just boss of the most powerful family in New York. He was the most powerful man in the Mafia, period. The agenda was simple: territories, business disputes, expansion into new rackets, and, unspoken but understood, the acknowledgement of Genovese's authority over national operations. But outside, something unexpected was taking shape. A state trooper named Edgar Croswell had been watching Joseph Barbara for months. He knew Barbara had ties to organized crime, and he'd noticed an unusual number of expensive cars in town the day before. Croswell didn't believe in coincidences, so when the stream of luxury vehicles began arriving that morning, he made a call. Roadblocks went up. Patrol cars moved in. Inside the estate, coffee was poured. Deals were discussed. Then a voice cut through the low murmur of conversation. Cops at first, there was disbelief. A meeting of this size, interrupted. Impossible. But then, from the windows, men could see the flashing lights at the end of the driveway. Officers stepping out, scanning the grounds. And just like that, the most powerful gathering in American organized crime dissolved into chaos. Men bolted for the doors, scattering into the surrounding woods and fields. Some tried to drive away, only to find the roads blocked. Others sprinted into the trees, their polished shoes slipping on frost-covered leaves. They were unaccustomed to running, especially from police. Some were caught in the open. Some were found hours later, shivering and breathless. Some escaped entirely, but not without being seen. The arrests themselves were minor. Most of the men were charged only with obstruction or questioned and released. But the real damage wasn't in the courtroom, it was in the headlines. The next morning, newspapers across the country blared the same unbelievable story. A secret meeting of mafia leaders exposed, names, faces, cities. Until that moment, law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, had publicly downplayed the very existence of a national organized crime network. Now, the truth was undeniable. For Vito Genovese, it was a disaster. The Appalachian meeting had been meant to showcase his dominance, to seal his reputation as the undisputed boss of bosses. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had placed him and dozens of others directly in the public eye. The FBI, embarrassed at being blindsided, launched a wave of investigations. State and federal agencies began coordinating in ways they hadn't before. Prosecutors suddenly had political backing to go after cases that had been shelved for years. And worst of all, the myth, the one the Mafia had relied on for decades, was broken. For years, the underworld had thrived on its invisibility. The idea that it didn't exist, except in whispers, now. The photographs told another story. Dozens of well-dressed men caught fleeing like common criminals. Their names printed in black ink, their faces in grainy newsprint. To the public, it was shocking. To the Mafia, it was humiliating. Genovese tried to downplay the event. He claimed it had been nothing more than a social gathering, a visit to a sick friend. But no one was convinced, least of all the law. The commission too was displeased. Bosses from other cities questioned why such a meeting had been called in a place so vulnerable to exposure. Some suspected Genovese had grown reckless, drunk on his own success, and in the shadows, old rivals began to stir. The truth was that Appalachian marked more than just a public embarrassment. It was the first real crack in the armor Genovese had spent years building. His rise had been meticulous, controlled, inevitable, but power, once fully grasped, has a way of breeding both arrogance and enemies. Appalachian gave those enemies an opening in the weeks that followed. Genovese found himself under surveillance. His associates were questioned, followed, pressured into becoming informants. Some quietly distanced themselves, fearing that the new attention could lead to indictments. And though Genovese's empire still ran, the rackets, the unions, the narcotics, it no longer moved in the shadows. Every shipment, every payoff, every meeting was at risk of being watched. For a man who had built his career on control, this was intolerable. The meeting that was meant to crown him king had instead put a target on his back, and though the streets still spoke his name with caution, the word untouchable no longer applied. It is here, in the cold of upstate New York, amid the scramble of powerful men fleeing into the woods, that the story begins to turn. From this point on, Genovese would fight not just to expand his power, but to hold on to it at all. And somewhere out there, unseen, the forces that would bring him down had already begun to move. The beginning of the end had arrived, not with a bullet, but with the sound of boots on frosted leaves, and the crackle of police radios cutting through the quiet morning air. The winter of 1959 settled over New York with a bitter stillness, but inside the corridors of organized crime, the air was anything but calm. Whispers had been swirling for months, quiet suggestions that Vito Genovese had grown too strong, too confident. For decades, he had been the man in the shadows, shaping events with patience and precision. Now, he stood at the peak of power, but the higher the summit, the sharper the winds, and those winds were beginning to cut against him. The betrayal came not as a sudden blow, but as a quiet tightening of a noose. On a cold February morning, federal agents arrived with warrants. The charge, narcotics trafficking. It was a serious accusation, and for a man in Genovese's position, potentially fatal to his freedom. What made it worse was the suspicion that this was no ordinary law enforcement operation. Many believed it was orchestrated from within, a careful setup by rivals on the commission who saw in Genovese not an ally, but a threat to their own survival. They had reason to fear him. His rise had been marked by calculated moves and an unwillingness to bend to those he considered weak. Now, the Appalachian fiasco had weakened him just enough for his enemies to strike. The federal case was bolstered by the testimony of informants and intermediaries, some of whom had been quietly turned months before. The stage was set, and Genovese was suddenly the star of a show he had not chosen to join. The courtroom was a theater of tension. Every day, Genovese would arrive in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable, his movements deliberate. The prosecutors painted him as the mastermind of an international narcotics network, pulling strings from the shadows. His defense countered with the familiar refrain: no direct evidence, no physical proof linking him to the drugs. But the government did not need to place the narcotics in his hands, only to convince the jury that his influence extended to every link in the chain. The trial lasted weeks. Outside, newspapers ran headlines that blurred fact and speculation, casting Genovese as a figure both feared and fascinating. Inside, the jury absorbed testimony from witnesses whose faces were often partially hidden, voices trembling under oath. In the end, the verdict came with a heavy finality: guilty. 15 years in federal prison. He did not flinch when the sentence was read. There was no outburst, no visible crack in the composure that had carried him through decades of underworld politics. If anything, there was a flicker of something else, not fear, but calculation. Prison was a cage, but even cages had doors, and Genovese had spent a lifetime finding the keys others didn't know existed. The first months behind bars were a test of adaptation. Lewisburg Penitentiary was a far cry from the dimly lit restaurants and plush apartments of his former life. Yet Genovese carried himself as if the walls were temporary inconveniences. His network, though battered, still functioned beyond the prison gates. Messages passed through lawyers, coded phrases embedded in innocuous letters. Associates visited regularly, some bringing updates on business, others seeking instructions. But influence in prison was not the same as influence on the street. Out there, power could be reinforced by presence. A glance, a handshake, a quiet conversation in a corner booth. In here, presence meant vulnerability. Every decision, every command had to travel through hands that could twist it, delay it, or simply ignore it. Allies became unpredictable. Some remained loyal out of respect, others out of fear, but more than a few saw opportunity in his absence. The empire that had once operated like a well-oiled machine began to develop cracks. Even so, Genovese found ways to exert control. The prison yard became his new boardroom. Under the watchful eyes of guards, he met with other inmates. Some of them connected to networks beyond the Mafia, black market smugglers, corrupt officials awaiting trial, even foreign contacts who had found themselves in American custody. Each conversation was brief, seemingly casual, but nothing was without purpose. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for correspondence, afternoons for exercise or chess. He was a skilled player, methodical, patient, unafraid to sacrifice pieces if it meant controlling the board. In those games, as in life, the goal was not the quick win, but the inevitable one. As the years passed, the physical toll became impossible to ignore. Genovese's hair thinned and turned silver, his once broad shoulders narrowing under the strain of age and confinement. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, unyielding, remained unchanged. Younger inmates, some barely into their 20s, would approach him in the yard, curious about the man whose name still carried weight in whispered conversations. He never gave lectures, never boasted. Instead, he listened, asked questions, and offered advice in short, deliberate phrases. In a world where everyone wanted to be heard, Genovese knew the power of being the one who listened. Letters from the outside became lifelines. Some carried coded updates from loyal associates. Others brought news of betrayals and losses. Each one was read carefully, then destroyed. Trust, already scarce, became a rare and precious currency. He learned to measure loyalty not by words, but by the silence that followed, the absence of leaks. The steady continuation of instructions carried out without deviation. Still, the erosion of his influence was slow but steady. Territories once under his control shifted hands. Profits that had once flowed toward him now found other pockets. His name was still spoken in certain rooms, but more often as a memory than a present force. The commission, ever pragmatic, adapted to life without his direct hand on the wheel. Yet even diminished, he was never irrelevant. Rivals knew better than to underestimate a man whose patience had carried him through decades of shifting alliances. In prison, he was insulated from certain dangers, untouchable in ways that even the most powerful men on the street were not. If he could not control the game entirely, he could still influence the board. By the mid-1960s, Genovese was in his late 60s, a survivor in a world where few men lived long enough to see such years. His health began to falter. Heart problems, recurring bouts of illness, but his mind remained a fortress. He continued to correspond with trusted allies, his handwriting neat and deliberate, as if each letter were a contract. There were rumors, always rumors, that he might secure an early release through appeals or influence. Some believed he still had enough power to sway decisions in his favor. Others thought the system simply wanted him to fade quietly away behind walls. He never addressed the speculation. Public hope was a dangerous thing. It gave enemies time to prepare. In the yard, the chess games continued. They were slower now, not for lack of skill, but for the pleasure of the process. He would sit for long moments before moving a piece, his gaze fixed not on the board but on the player across from him. In those moments, it was as if he was seeing something far beyond the black and white squares, a reminder that every move, no matter how small, was part of a larger design. By the late 1960s, his world had narrowed to the cell, the yard, and the echo of a life once lived in whispers and shadows. Yet there was no sign of regret in him. Regret implied a mistake, and in Genovese's mind, mistakes were simply moves in a game that had not yet ended. The empire he had built now existed in fragments, scattered across the city and beyond. Some of those pieces had been absorbed by former allies, others claimed by men who had once feared to even speak his name. But even in fragmentation, there was a strange endurance. His influence, though faded, had left deep grooves in the structure of organized crime, grooves that would guide its shape for years to come. One winter afternoon, a younger inmate asked him directly if he missed the old days, the power, the respect, the streets that seemed to bend to his will. Genovese looked at him for a long time before answering. "Power," he said finally, "is not what they think it is. It's not the noise, or the fear, or the money. Power is being able to disappear and still be remembered." The words hung in the cold air, heavy with the weight of a man who understood the cost of the life he had chosen. As the decade drew to a close, Genovese's health worsened. His steps grew slower, His hands trembled slightly when he wrote, but his mind remained anchored in the same unshakable calm that had carried him from the tenements of Naples to the highest table in American organized crime. In the silence of his cell, he seemed almost at peace, not with the world, but with the game he had played. The fall from the summit had been long and measured, not a sudden drop, but a slow descent into shadow. And yet, in that shadow, Genovese remained what he had always been, patient, watchful, and unwilling to be forgotten. The winter morning was unremarkable. Grey light slipped through the narrow windows of the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. The corridors hummed with the muted rhythm of another day in captivity. Footsteps on concrete, the occasional clang of a steel door, the low murmur of voices belonging to men whose worlds had shrunk to a few hundred square feet. Somewhere in that warren of locked rooms lay Vito Genovese, once the most feared man in the American underworld. By now, in early 1969, the fear had ebbed. Time had dulled his edges. His hair, once dark and slicked back, was now white and thinning. The once broad shoulders had narrowed. Prison had been his home for a decade, and like all long-term inmates, he had adapted, not because he wanted to, but because there was no other choice. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, he did not wake. Sometime in the early hours, the heart that had driven him through decades of ruthless calculation simply stopped. There was no dramatic collapse, no whispered final words, just the stillness that comes for all men, regardless of what they've done, regardless of how far they've risen. The news reached the outside world quickly. Vito Genovese dies in prison, the headlines read. A few newspapers in New York ran small photos, black and white images of a man in his prime, eyes sharp and suspicious. The stories were clipped, factual. They noted his convictions, his role in organized crime, and the enduring strength of the crime family that still bore his name. In the larger world, his death was just another headline in a busy week. But for those who knew the life, the name still carried weight. Inside the underworld, there was no public mourning, no grand funerals with limousines lined in a procession. Genovese had been behind bars too long to inspire open loyalty. Still, among the old guard, his passing marked the end of an era. One more bridge to the old mafia, ways quietly erased. For those who had been with him in his prime, memories were complicated. Genovese had been more than a boss. He had been a strategist, a man who could see 5 moves ahead. He had also been merciless, a man who believed loyalty was maintained through a precise balance of reward and fear. Few had dared to cross him, and those who did often vanished. Yet prison had changed the game. Behind walls and razor wire, his control had thinned. Messages could be sent, orders could be given, but without his presence, the family had learned to adapt without him. The world outside had moved on, reshaping itself under new leadership and new alliances. Still, the Genovese family had not fallen. His methods, the discipline, the secrecy, the emphasis on keeping the organization insulated from unnecessary exposure had been ingrained into its very structure. Even in his absence, his influence was there, an invisible hand guiding decisions. In the final years, those who saw him up close noticed a shift. He was still sharp. Prison gossip claimed he could read a man's intentions just by watching him cross the yard, but the fire was smaller. Age and confinement had done what rivals and prosecutors had failed to do. His health began to falter. There were reports of chest pains, a fatigue that left him sitting longer, moving slower in the prison yard. He was a quieter figure. Sometimes he'd play chess with another inmate, his moves deliberate and unhurried. The games were less about winning and more about the ritual, the familiar act of thinking 3, 4, 5 moves ahead. Even if the battlefield was just 64 squares of black and white, those who spoke to him in these final years say he rarely spoke of the past in detail. When he did, it was with a kind of selective memory. The violence was never mentioned. The betrayals were glossed over. He spoke instead of business and opportunity, as though the decades of blood and fear were just part of an inevitable process. On the morning of his death, the prison routine went on. Breakfast was served. The guards made their rounds. The cell doors clanged open. Somewhere in the quiet corner of the prison hospital, a sheet was pulled over him, and one of the last living links to the old Prohibition-era mafia was gone. News of his passing rippled quietly through New York's underworld. For some, it was a relief, the final confirmation that the old boss would never return to reclaim his throne. For others, it was the end of a chapter. There was no one else quite like Vito Genovese. No one who combined raw ambition with such cold, calculated patience. His funeral was private, attended by family and a handful of old associates. There were no speeches, no public displays of grief. The coffin was lowered, the earth shoveled in, and the mourners left quietly, their faces set in the same unreadable expressions that had kept them alive in a dangerous world. In the years that followed, the Genovese crime family remained one of the most powerful mafia organizations in America. It adapted, as it always had, to the changing tides of law enforcement and criminal opportunity. But the name stayed, a permanent reminder of the man who had once sat at its head and reshaped its structure to his vision. Historians and crime writers have debated Genovese's legacy. Some paint him as a tyrant whose paranoia and ambition nearly destroyed the balance of organized crime. Others see him as a brilliant strategist whose methods ensured his family's survival for decades. Both views may be true. Like most men who live their lives in shadows, the truth is layered, impossible to separate cleanly from myth. In the end, what remains is the paradox. A man who sought absolute control, yet spent his final decade powerless. A figure who commanded fear and loyalty in equal measure, yet died, alone in a prison bed. The final image is not of the powerful boss at the head of a long table, nor the feared figure in the smoky backroom of a New York club. It is of an empty prison bed, the morning light cutting through barred windows, falling across the pale sheets. The room is silent, except for the faint sounds of the prison beyond. Footsteps, distant voices, the hum of life continuing without him. It is a reminder that even the most formidable men, those who once seemed untouchable, end in the same way as all others, quietly, without ceremony, leaving behind only the echo of their influence. Vito Genovese had spent his life climbing, scheming, positioning himself for advantage in every situation. He had faced rivals, prosecutors, and the shifting currents of a dangerous underworld, and for decades he had emerged on top. But time, as it always does, proved the one opponent he could not outmaneuver. The man was gone, but the machinery he built remained silent, efficient, still moving in the shadows. That was, perhaps, his final victory, to become a name that endured beyond his life. A ghost in the machinery of organized crime. And so, on that unremarkable February day, Vito Genovese exited the stage, not with the gunfire or bloodshed that had marked so much of his career, but with a quiet that felt almost alien to the life he had lived. The bars, the walls, the guards, all of it faded into the stillness of death. Outside, the world turned, unaware that one of the architects of its hidden history had just left it forever.